Well, weapons exist to be used. We have our own principles. What do they mean? That we are ready to use weapons, including any weapons, including those weapons you mentioned, if we are talking about the existence of the Russian state.
Globalize.
Russian President Vladimir Putin once again floating the idea of using nuclear weapons somehow in some way. He's been rather vague, but nonetheless, when it comes to nuclear weapons, that is not a threat anyone wants to take lightly, and that is what we want to discuss today.
This is Globalize, Deutsche Welle's podcast on global security policy. I'm Isha Bhatia Sanan. I'm senior editor here at Deutsche Welle.
So, and how close are we to nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapon use, or maybe even arms control to turn the temperature a little bit down? Let's listen to our guests. But first, I'm William Glucroft, security reporter for DW. And we do have two great guests with us today. The first is Reshmi Kazi. She's a professor of the Nelson Mandela Centre for Peace and Conflict Resolution in New Delhi.
And our second guest today is Professor Narushige Michishita. He goes by Michi. He is Executive Vice President of National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo, Japan.
Michi and Reshmi, we just heard that soundbite, a recent comment from Russian President Vladimir Putin referring to weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons, and as usual, as he said many times, kind of threatening the use or hinting at the use of them, talking about weapons are there to be used. Michi, let me first turn to you. When you hear something like that, and we've heard Vladimir Putin say that many times, what do you make of it?
I think we lost
can be used.
Oh, sorry.
You lost me?
No, we have you. We lost Reshmi. So while we're waiting for Reshmi, just your thoughts on that latest Putin comments on the nukes.
Sure. Yeah, so, when we talk about use of weapons, there are different ways of using them. One is to actually use it to destroy things, and the other is coercive use by suggesting the use of those weapons. And in the second sense, Mr. Putin has already been using nuclear weapons because by suggesting the possible use of nuclear weapons, he has been deterring NATO countries from intervening in the war in one way or another, and discouraging those countries in Europe from becoming more proactive in helping Ukraine.
What worries me, Michi, about that is, that's a really good point you make, that he's already using them. But for that threat to be credible, just for NATO to be self-deterring, at some point, the worry is that he would have to actually make good on the use. Otherwise, it's an empty threat. So I see a threat escalation here. How worried should we be about that?
Right. At this point, because the war is not necessarily going badly for the Russians or for Mr. Putin, Russia is kind of fighting back. So I don't think he has to use nuclear weapons at this point. But if things, kind of becomes negative for him, and he might be forced to, or he might be encouraged to use nuclear weapons. And actually, in fact, Russia has already come up with this concept of escalate to de-escalate. So the idea is, in order to de-escalate the situation or make things more favorable to Russia, Russia might be willing to use nuclear weapons in a limited way. So that's a concept, and he might actually invoke the concept and use nuclear weapons although in a limited manner.
What do you mean by
that's our
limited
concern.
manner? How exactly are we going to see Russia use nuclear weapons?
Yeah, for example, explode in the most limited way can be the use of nuclear weapons, tactical small yield nuclear weapons, just to scare other countries, like by exploding one nuclear bomb in the sky, in the air, without which would not cause any physical damage, but would cause a tremendous psychological impact on the observers, or the belligerent, as well as supporters, or I mean Ukraine, as well as supporters of Ukraine.
You mentioned there's many different ways that Russia, or anyone really, could use a nuclear weapon. Are all the ways that one could employ a nuclear weapon breaking the nuclear taboo, or are there different levels of response to that, some kind of use of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, nobody has used nuclear weapons in war since 1945. So it would be a breaking of a taboo if Putin used nuclear weapons, even in sort of a limited manner. So it would be a disastrous, very negative, event. But if, as I said, Putin just exploded one bomb in the air, it would be very difficult for the countries to respond strongly. You don't want to escalate, the war. So we cannot really expect what kind of impact that would have both on both Russia and other countries. But certainly the breaking of a nuclear taboo would be a very negative event for the entire world.
Do I understand you correctly in saying that there are ways in which Vladimir Putin could use a nuclear weapon and get away with it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly there will be consequences. For example, the nations in the world will try to impose additional sanctions. But major sanctions are already imposed, and there are some countries which are not necessarily, abiding by those sanctions. So Putin can, Putin's life might be, we might be able to make his life a little more difficult, but not too much.
Well, sanctions haven't really worked so much against Russia so far. So, taking sanctions a step further, you think that's really going to make a big difference? Or is that really going to escalate the whole
No,
situation?
so that's a problem. Additional sanctions will not, be too effective. So it would be symbolically important, but realistically, it would, we might not be able to do too much.
Okay, so when we talk about nuclear war, nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, to a layman, it seems like that's going to be the end of the world. So you have this Hollywood kind of an imagery in front of you where the whole world is coming to an end. But just like you said in the beginning, there are different levels of it. So if you could paint a picture for us, if this is going to get into that direction where we see the usage of nuclear weapons, there are different types. There are these tactical warheads. What are they exactly? What is going to be the effect like? And we know that for the last 2 years, ever since the war broke in Ukraine, Ukraine has actually been preparing itself for that. Hospitals there have been preparing for this kind of a scenario. So, what is this preparation about, and what is it that we would see in case a nuclear war breaks out?
Well, I mean, as I said, I'm not overly concerned about that possibility because if Mr. Putin decides to use a nuclear weapon in a sort of a demonstrative manner, that means certainly we will be scared, people will be scared. But on the other hand, that might demonstrate the fact that even Mr. Putin, is not willing to use nuclear weapons to actually destroy some things and kill people. So that might actually undermine the credibility of his threat. So it cuts both ways. So I don't think use of nuclear weapons will necessarily benefit Russia and Hamas.
I'd love to bring it to the level of where you are in Japan. On one hand, Japan is part of the G7 and the Western Alliance supporting Ukraine in many different kinds of ways. On the other hand, geographically, Japan can at least feel very far from events happening in Eurasia, in Europe. How does the nuclear threat look from the perspective of Japan, where of course there's much closer threats to Japan and your region?
Yeah, so we are one of the most important concerns that we have in this region, in Indo-Pacific region, is the possibility of China attacking Taiwan. And so we are trying hard. Japan has decided to increase its defense budget by 60%. That's a tremendous rise over 5 years. And in order to bolster our deterrence with China. But if China, from the Chinese perspective, if I'm a Chinese military planner, and if I decide to attack Taiwan, I would do my best to prevent the United States and Japan from intervening in the war, because Taiwan is relatively weak militarily, but the U.S. and Japan are very powerful military powers. So unless China can prevent Japan and the U.S. and neutralize them in that kind of situation, the likelihood of success of invasion of Taiwan would be slim. So if I'm a Chinese military planner, I will definitely think about using nuclear weapons, at least coercively, especially in Japan, because Japan is the only country which suffered nuclear bombings. The nuclear bomb, atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and the other on Nagasaki. So Japanese people are susceptible to nuclear coercion. So that's the concerns that security specialists in this region have about possibility of nuclear use.
So would you say then, a lot of people say that, China is watching very closely to events in Ukraine for kind of a playbook on how they could approach Taiwan. When it comes to nuclear weapons, is Russia creating a playbook, a nuclear playbook, potentially for China?
Yeah, I think so. So China is learning from Russia how effective or how ineffective nuclear weapons can be in wartime. And I have actually one concern, which is because the war in the theater of the center of gravity or of the war in Ukraine, it's basically a land warfare, right? But the war in the Pacific or across the Taiwan Strait, it's going to be basically air and naval warfare that we are talking about. And unfortunately, nuclear weapons might be it might be easier for China to use nuclear weapons, because China is going to use nuclear weapons at sea rather than on land. And for example, if China attacks Japanese naval surface vessel, and if it destroyed that naval vessel, there will not be collateral damages. Only a military personnel and the ship will be destroyed, and that will not cause any civilian deaths and casualties. So, in a way, I'm not saying using nuclear weapons is easy. It's difficult, but in relative terms, it would be, one can use nuclear weapons at sea little more easily than on the ground. So that's another concern that I have about
And
the situation in this region.
what role could Quad play in this, in the de risking of nuclear threats in the Indo Pacific?
Well, so in order to prevent the use of nuclear weapons or successful coercive use of nuclear weapons, we have to bolster our own nuclear deterrence, right? But since Japan does not possess and is not willing to acquire nuclear weapons, we have to rely on what we call extended nuclear deterrence that the US is providing us. And so we are talking very closely, with the American counterpart, and we are talking about different scenarios in which China might use nuclear weapons coercively or actually, and thinking about how best to respond. And in order to make our deterrence credible, what kind of additional capabilities or operational concepts ideas that we might have to introduce. So we are discussing those things with the U.S. counterpart.
Is there worry then, as there is in Europe, given the political situation in the United States, whether Donald Trump comes back or not, about that security guarantee and that extended nuclear deterrence being there?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Mr. Trump will be more unpredictable than Mr. Biden, so that's a concern. But again, it cuts both ways because Mr. Trump will be unpredictable to us, but he will be unpredictable to the Chinese leaders as well. So they have to take maybe they will be forced to take an extra caution in thinking about what to do with Taiwan when Mr. Trump is in office. So we are certainly concerned about the negative consequences of Mr. Trump getting re-elected, but it's not, he will not only, we are not overly concerned about that.
Yeah, as you say, it cuts both ways. Unpredictability and ambiguity can be escalatory or de-escalatory. Although I don't know if that's a risk I'd want to take when it comes to nuclear weapons.
I know, I don't exactly.
Well, coming back to the threats, now, Putin has said this at a time when the country is going for elections. So, do you think that's a real threat? How do you see the timing of the interview that he's given recently?
Well, I mean, certainly we don't know, his mind, but and my guess is he said what he said because, partly because of the election. So that's a sort of a good news. I mean, he wants to look strong and, manly in front of, in the eyes of Russian voters. So if that was a main purpose of his saying that, that's not such a bad thing.
There's two broad takes on Vladimir Putin's nuclear comments. One is that every time he talks about nuclear weapons, it's normalizing it, and we can't let nuclear weapons be normalized. The other is that he's bluffing. He's just it's just a matter of pride. These are, fake red lines. We shouldn't look into it. It's nothing new. Where do you come down on these sort of two extreme perspectives on Vladimir Putin's nuclear rhetoric?
Yeah, I always try to be in the middle.
It's a good place to be.
So I don't want to overestimate his rhetoric, the meaning, but I don't want to underestimate what he's talking about. So, but in a way, the more frequently he talks about possible use of nuclear weapons, in a way, the less the credibility will become because when it's basically a crying wolf kind of situation. If you keep saying the same thing again and again, the credibility of your words will diminish, right? So in a way, he's doing just that. So it might be a good thing for us, but at the same time, we have to. We don't want, we should not underestimate what he says.
Yeah, that's what worries me. Like I said earlier, the more he says it, at some point he might have to make good on it, and I don't want to be there when that bluff gets called.
Right. That's a good point.
I would also like to understand the technicalities of it. Now, both US and Russia, they've reduced their nuclear arsenal since Cold War. The numbers have reduced a lot, but the kind of weapons that are there, they're different. They are, of course, not the same as they were in the Cold War era. So does the reduced number mean anything if they are way more dangerous than the weapons that we had earlier?
Well, I mean, the explosion yield and the destructive power of those weapons are tremendous, that the reduced number does not ease us too much. They are still dangerous. And if you compare the number of nuclear weapons that the US and Russia have, China has much smaller number of nuclear weapons, although China and also North Korea are developing and increasing the number of nuclear weapons that they have. But it's not, if you compare the number with those of the U.S. and Russia. The U.S. and Russia are still much more capable in terms of nuclear capabilities.
And delivery systems as well is something we have to take into consideration.
That's right. Yeah. Both the U.S. And Russia maintain very robust land-based nuclear missile systems, sea-based nuclear systems, and bombers, nuclear-capable bombers and fighters. Whereas China is developing all three, but its sea-based nuclear, submarines, nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, are still not as capable and as quiet as US or Russian counterpart.
India has conducted the first flight test of a long-range ballistic missile called Agni 5. What do you make of that?
India is strengthening and improving its nuclear capabilities. So it's a sort of a bad news in a sense that nuclear weapons are proliferating and nuclear missiles are proliferating. But at the same time, from a deterrent perspective, it might be a good thing because India and China are somewhat, confronted with each other militarily. So if India has better nuclear capabilities, China would be forced to take a look at both nuclear weapons that the Americans have as well as Indians have. So that might make it difficult for China to sort of keep competing with. It might actually undermine China's nuclear edge vis-a-vis us. So it might be it cuts both ways.
Now, with this missile system, India can actually reach China. Now, this is something that the kind of technology India didn't have so far. How do you think China is going to react to that?
Well, China will, regardless of what India is doing, China has been trying to improve its nuclear capabilities. It has been deploying a large number of, it's digging holes and, developing more silos for land-based systems. And so I don't think China is not necessarily and is responding to what India has been doing. China is definitely, I think, the most important nuclear competitor for China at this point is the US.
You mentioned so far only briefly North Korea. It wasn't long ago in a pre-Ukraine world that North Korea was the big hotspot for nuclear tensions. Is that not the case anymore? Or how does that view to North Korea look from where you're sitting in Tokyo?
Well, certainly, we are concerned about North Korea's nuclear weapons, but the number of nuclear weapons that North Korea has and the quality of is not as large as that of China, and the conventional capabilities that North Korea has are quite outdated. So I don't think, whereas I believe it's possible for China to actually attack Taiwan and use nuclear weapons as a basically coercive means of neutralizing the US and Japan in that war, that's possible. It would be very unlikely for North Korea to attack South Korea in the first place. So I'm much less worried about, North Korea's use of nuclear weapons.
And the number of weapons that are there, well, as you said, of course, before Ukraine happened, everybody was indeed talking about North Korea or even Iran collecting nuclear stuff. When we look at Asia, the number is really less as compared to US or Russia.
For example, depends on the source. I mean, there are different sources say different things, but supposedly there are about 60 tactical nuclear weapons that China has for the use in this region, in the Pacific region. So that's not huge, right?
So it is something to worry about, but not as worrisome.
On the long list of worries, it's lower on the list of worries than other worries.
We are worried about that, but I mean, if you compare that number and with the nuclear weapons and the sophisticated nuclear systems that the United States has, still I think the extended nuclear deterrence that the U.S. is providing us is very, very credible.
Yeah, let me pick up on that because you also mentioned proliferation. Japan certainly has the technology, the technical capacity to develop nuclear weapons if it wanted to. It's more of a political decision that it hasn't. And of course, the history, the historical trauma, as you've pointed out. But you have mentioned proliferation. That proliferation is a problem right now all around the world. What would the situation have to be for Japan to make a political decision that it actually needs nuclear weapons of its own?
Yeah, some people say that it's easy for Japan to acquire nuclear weapons, and well, maybe it's not too difficult for Japan to acquire just bombs. If you acquire nuclear weapons, to acquire nuclear weapons, and create a credible nuclear deterrence or deterrent, it's not easy. You have to construct a credible, very robust, well-protected command, control, and communication systems. Targeting, you have to be able to acquire targeting information. You have to start protecting those nuclear weapons that you operate. So it's not easy. It's a lot of money. And when I was talking to my French security specialist friends, they are complaining about two money eaters in arsenal. I mean, the defense systems. One was Rafale fighter aircraft, quite expensive, cutting-edge fighter aircraft. The other one is independent nuclear forces. I mean, it's not, they are very expensive, hard to maintain, develop, and maintain. And in most of the cases, you don't use them, right? So, we don't want to spend a lot of money on something it's very unlikely that we use.
As Vladimir Putin himself said, weapons are meant to be used. So what's the point of having them if you're not going to use them?
Yeah.
And I think you make a good point that those points you just brought up about Japan are exactly what European countries are asking right now. There's this talk about getting nukes for the European Union, which the technology aside and the weapons themselves aside is a massive undertaking, which I think you've very nicely pointed out. I think we have Reshmi back, which would be great because we'd love to get more of the Indian insights.
Right. So, Reshmi, we did touch upon the Agni 5 testing. So, if you could give us some details, what is Agni 5 exactly, and what was the need of the test at this point?
Well, the test that took place, is basically a MRF capability Agni 5, which has 5,000 kilometer range, and this puts us in the very prestigious group of the P5 countries. The P5 countries are the only countries at present who have the MRF capability. So it definitely, it's a technological feat for us. It's a great technological achievement as far as our nuclear capability is concerned. But of course, we have a doctrine which is grounded on the principles of no first use and credible minimum deterrence. So I guess when you have a doctrine which is premised upon a no first use policy, I guess there is a second strike capability that is involved here, and for that you require you. I mean, like, one cannot be just caught off guard. We are in a zone where we are flanked on the two sides by two nuclear capable countries, unfortunately, with whom we do not share cordial relations at present. So any country, for that matter, as in, I just gave you the example of P5 countries. They also have this capability, and I think it's a great technological, feat for us, for India, to have, mastered this capability. As regards the reasons why we have gone for it, I keep on saying that unless there is a requirement, in the sense there is a radical change in our strategic environment, we really do not need to go in for any kind of aggressive, arms buildup. But as I said, we are flanked by two nuclear adversaries on both our northern and the western side. And as regards radical changes, China is in the early stages of developing its BMD. So I guess that is something where we need to be more cautious. And certainly, we would not like to be caught like a sitting duck in the region. So I guess that's one factor which has a sort of, can be one reason, can be cited as one reason why, in the interest of our national goals, national interest rather, as our for our interest, protection of our sovereign interest, we have gone for this capability.
Reshmi, I'm curious. Given India's no first use official policy, Russia, on the other hand, has a first use policy, as far as we can tell from strategy documents, to whatever extent they have significance. And Vladimir Putin is regularly threatening or talking about the use of nuclear weapons. How does that impact India's relations with Russia?
Well, we have an independent policy. We have an independent foreign policy. We have an independent, our own nuclear policy is independent of, any other country's nuclear policies, or for that matter, their projections. So I don't think it directly has any impact on India, because it certainly does not affect our no first use policy, even though Russia has gone and being an NPT member has threatened a non-nuclear weapon state as per the NPT definition with nuclear threats. And though even though we are not an NPT member, I don't think it makes any direct impact on our policies as such, particularly on our no first use policy.
You've talked about the P5 countries. It's the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK. The two nuclear adversaries you're talking about, that's China and Pakistan. Does India see a real threat of attack from these two countries?
Uh, well, China also has a no first use policy, so I don't really see any impending threat in the near future, nuclear, attack from China. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I think we've had 4 wars since 1947, since the time we both became independent. There have been several wars. And even across the LOC skirmishes, we had military exchanges, but the nuclear angle, remotely also. I mean, like, there has been rhetoric, but I guess that happens in a situation where it's when you have two adversaries, nuclear adversaries, there can be rhetoric, but rhetoric and nuclear, sort of tangible nuclear dangers. We are both, particularly on the Indian side, are very aware of the consequences, given the fact that we share borders. So there are some modest nuclear risk reduction measures between India and Pakistan, and we have adhered to that. There hasn't been any major nuclear or for that matter, any remotely nuclear kind of skirmish or exchange in that sense, or even for that matter, any miscalculation so far.
I'm curious. We talked to Michi just earlier about how China is looking at what's going on in Ukraine, in particular vis-a-vis the Russian nuclear threat. On one hand, to use his words, it cuts both ways. On one hand, China might be incentivized to use nuclear weapons, for example, in a conflict with Taiwan. But at the same time, China has warned Russia against using nuclear weapons of any kind in Ukraine. What is India's take on nuclear use, particularly in Ukraine?
Any kind of catastrophic attack that imposes, that inflicts insufferable loss and insufferable pain, which cannot be explained, in words enough. Certainly, India is not in favor of that. So, any nuclear attack on, or for that matter, even nuclear threats for that, the threat of use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine is certainly not something which India will uphold or stand by. So, and that goes everywhere. I mean, certainly India will not stand for any kind of nuclear attack after what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Michi is from there, so like I keep on, as a professor, I keep on telling my students that none of us, even in this audience, none of us, we were born in 1945. Probably our parents were also not born then. But when we talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we get goosebumps. Our generation, our previous generation, and for generations to come, we get goosebumps. So certainly not, something we India will certainly not stand for something which inflicts insufferable pain and devastation on humanity and mankind.
But at the same time, when you were not there, we were talking about the timing of these threats and these actions. So, for instance, Vladimir Putin, he publicly threatened that Russia can use the weapons because weapons are there to be used. And that was just a couple of days before the country was going for elections. And now, when it comes to the missile testing in India, what would you like to say about the timing? Because another couple of weeks, India is going to announce elections as well.
Definitely now, the technological feat that we have achieved, it is definitely a prestige factor. As far as elections are concerned, maybe among some quarters this can act as a huge boost, but I would not really say that it would lead to any kind of jingoism. I think India has been very, very, even though we have a credible minimum, we stand for a credible deterrence, but we also stand for a minimal deterrence at the same time. So the timing, yes, that's quite interesting, an observation, but I guess it does not really change our traditional stand as far as our nuclear capability is concerned, which is to have a minimal and not an arms race posture, force posture.
I'm glad. That's a great segue to where I want to go now, and I want to bring Michi back into the conversation because we've been talking a lot about proliferation, and Michi himself mentioned the P word, proliferation. I want to talk about arms control, the other side of things. Arms control, as we know, nuclear weapons treaties are essentially falling apart between the United States and Russia. But many nuclear hawks will say it doesn't really matter what happens with the U.S. and Russia because you still have all these other nuclear states that are under no such treaties. So, Michi, I want to get both of your thoughts on this. But first to Michi, where are we on arms control, especially among countries like China, like India, like Pakistan? Is there any chance of arms control and reducing nuclear forces?
Mm. I don't see any realistic, meaningful arms control agreement agreements are likely to be signed in the foreseeable future. Why? Because North Korea is, increasing the number of nuclear weapons. China is developing its nuclear arsenal very rapidly. So when they are on that path, it's in their interest, not to have any arms control agreements, right? So, but the thing is, if they have acquired certain number of nuclear weapons and achieved certain level of nuclear capabilities, then not necessarily parity, but then they might become a little more willing to talk to the Americans and other countries to negotiate some kind of a. But at this point, I don't see any likelihood.
So we've talked about Japan, Korea, Ukraine, Russia, US, India, China. We've really covered pretty much the whole world where there are nuclear weapons and
The whole nuclear menu.
the whole nuclear menu. That's the wonderful way to put it. Reshmi, how worried should people be about this whole scenario? Everyone collecting more nuclear weapons and giving out threats. I know some countries like India and China have a no first use policy. Others would like to use it first if they need to. How real is the threat? How worried should everyone be?
I think there are reasons to worry because at present, as Nishi also pointed out, we cannot be really. There is not much optimism as far as arms control is concerned. Unfortunately, during the Cold War days, when arms control did have a lot of relevance, of course. Like once the picture was clear that deterrence, nuclear deterrence is almost a bankrupt kind of a insurance. It's a defective insurance because even though you had mutual assured destruction, that's mad. It was not enough to protect human mankind, from the destructive effect of nuclear weapons. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki amply demonstrated that. Once that realization was there, of course, arms control was given a very, like a relevant space, a very important space. We had a whole lot of arms control measures. Unfortunately, most of these arms control agreements, they are no longer, in vogue. And the New START treaty, this is also the kind of relations which Russia and US is having, the bilaterals that are there existing between them, these two binaries, it's sort of turning off the tap slowly but definitely. Unfortunately, it is turning off the tap of the last arms control measure between the among the nuclear weapon states who happen to own the 90% of world's nuclear forces. So the situation seems to be very bleak. And more so, what I also observe is at a time when United States and Russia, under again the New START treaty, they have cut down on their nuclear forces than what it was during the Cold War days. There are other countries, particularly like China, even for that matter, Pakistan, the second-tier nuclear weapon states, and now what is also happening in the Middle East. There are countries in Northeast Asia as well. There is. There is a sufficient sort of noise, if I can put it that way, for the nuclear currency. Moreover, countries like China, they are going for massive modernization processes. They have more advanced kind of weaponry, delivery systems, aggressive doctrines. Russia, in this case, we see, it has gone ahead with nuclear threats against a non-nuclear weapon states. Then again, important arms control measures like de-ratification of CTBT by Russia now because it wants to have parity with the United States. The FMCT is nowhere in the picture. So arms control does not really have a good traction out here at present. And in that circumstance, I'm sure there are reasons, substantial reasons, in fact, to worry about.
Nuclear cat is not only out of the bag, which it has been for a very long time, but it seems to have completely run away, which is not necessarily the note I want to end this episode on, but I think we will have to end it there. Narushige, if you want to just add anything more to what Reshmi said before we close it out and say so long to you both.
Sure. When we talk about how to deal with nuclear threat, we can certainly talk about nuclear deterrence to counter nuclear coercion, but there are other things that we can do. One is, introduction of ballistic missile defense systems, because most of the times nuclear weapons are delivered by ballistic missiles. And so in that sense, Japan has been doing a great job. Japan has invested more than $25 billion. That's a lot of money. And has acquired both a higher upper tier exo-atmospheric defense system, missile defense system called the SM-3, and land-based endo-atmospheric lower tier defense system called the Patriot PAC-3. So we are in a very good shape. And also Japanese government has been conducting civil defense exercises based on missile attack scenario since 2017. So we are combining those efforts in order to mitigate the effectiveness of nuclear coercion, either by North Korea or China.
So that was Reshmi Kazi, professor of the Nelson Mandela Centre for Peace and Conflict Resolution in New Delhi, and Narushige Michishita, the executive vice president of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies based in Tokyo. Two very well-informed voices on the nuclear situation in the world today. Not exactly the nicest situation.
So how close are we really to a nuclear war? If you're watching us on YouTube, do let us know your thoughts. We'll be reading your comments. And if you're listening to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, do leave us a review. Thank you. I'm Isha Bhatia Sanan. I'm senior editor here at Deutsche Welle.
And I'm William Glucroft, security reporter for DW. We look forward to seeing you and hearing you on our episode next month.
Goodbye.
Globalize, a new take on security policy by DW.